Hello and welcome back once again. It's a new year and today I will be talking about Genesis's 1973 magnum opus, Selling England by the Pound. Many would argue their best album. I, in fact, many times would argue that it's their best album. Last time I think I said that I preferred Foxtrot slightly, but honestly it varies wildly day by day. And I think there's a very strong argument to be made that any of the three studio albums Genesis released between 1972 and 1974 could be considered their best. Similar to last time, no real lineup change, not much in the way of studio drama. Although when you read about the behind-the-scenes goings-on during the making of this record, you do start to get a sense, reading between the lines, of the creative tensions between Gabriel and Banks, and Hackett and Banks, that would eventually lead to the breakdown and eventual dissolution, first of the Gabriel lineup of the band, and then several years after that, to Steve Hackett leaving and the advent of the trio version of Genesis that would persist for the rest of their career. Specifically, there were some disagreements about song choices. On a sonic level, the sound has been refined quite a bit. This is probably the closest Genesis ever got to the early 70s thing that was peaking around 73, 74. It's a fuller, richer sound. It's lost some of its acoustic pastoral quality, although the English folk is still very much in effect. There's a little bit of jazz fusion in some of the instrumentals, primarily from Hackett and Collins, but the balance is very much still on the prog side of things. There are never any full-blown excursions into jazz as there are on some contemporary albums. Really, I think the last thing I have to touch on before I can stop boring you with my introduction and actually talk about the tracks is the concept. This is a very, very loose concept album about, well, as the title would indicate, England in the 1970s and the sort of perceived waning of English culture and folk traditions in response to American hegemonic domination of Anglophone culture. It's a bit like Dark Side of the Moon in that the concept is present on most tracks, but it really doesn't beat you over the head with it. And frankly, if I hadn't been told this was a concept album about the waning of English folkways in response to global American hegemonic domination, I'm not entirely sure I would have picked up on that myself, partially because the lyrics are often very topical, but they're also very layered. It's a side of Gabriel that you really see on this album and the next album, and then it disappears. He doesn't really do this in his solo career. He's much more straightforward and to the point, and that is good. I love solo Peter Gabriel, but at the same time, it's a side of him that I almost wish had continued moving forward. But I have bored you for long enough, so let's talk about the tracks. Dancing with the Moonlit Night begins the album with a very stark vocal leading into a sort of acoustic pastoral bit that eventually leads into a much more grandiose and epic mellotron-driven composition that then transitions into a sort of chorus and then a fast Hackett solo bit that has some of his finest guitar work while he was with the band. And then back into the chorusy segment again with a brief Banks solo, which itself transitions into a folksy outro that concludes the track with some periodic atmospheric mellotron. It's an extremely strong album opener, yet another addition to a discography that is already full of them at this point. Lyrically, there's a lot going on here, a lot of stuff that frankly, as an American born in the 1990s, I am not in a position to really talk about. Like I said in the intro, this album and the next one are really sort of the high water mark for a kind of layered and esoteric style of Gabriel lyrics, and this definitely is an example of that. So for track 2, we have another fantastic song, I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, a slightly anachronistic psychedelic pop song about a homeless lawnmower and the people and the world that he inhabits. It was a minor hit, their biggest during the Gabriel era, and in some respects, both harkens forward to the future direction of Genesis and backwards towards the psychedelic pop sound of From Genesis to Revelation. Although in comparison to those, this is an extremely mature sounding track. I probably don't need to say this, but it's another real highlight of the album. Firth of Fifth is yet another phenomenal track, a real career highlight for both Banks and Hackett, opening with an extended piano solo that I've always really loved, to a bombastic, mellotron-heavy piece about a shipwreck. You get some good lyrics, some very good language. As I mentioned before, this album has some of the very best Genesis lyrics. And then you get a reprise of the opening keyboard bit, but with synths. And I know some people really dislike this part of the song. They think it ruins the whole thing, but I like it. I haven't had an opportunity to really talk about this so far, but there's a school of thought amongst some listeners of Genesis that regards Tony Banks as the worst part of the band and actually really specifically marks him out as like one of the worst synth players in prog, which is very interesting to me because Tony Banks, he does hog the spotlight, especially after Gabriel's departure, and you do, reading between the lines, get the sense that he is the source of a lot of the creative discord within the band during its peak years. But at the same time, I've always thought he was one of the more tasteful synth players during the golden era of progressive rock in the 70s. But anyway, that is followed by one of the best Steve Hackett guitar solos. Some would argue the best solo he ever played with the band. I don't know about that. I think the stuff he's doing at the end of Supper's Ready, I think is my personal favorite Steve Hackett guitar. But that being said, this is an incredible solo. And after that, the vocal part of the song returns for one last run through, and it's over. Something I cannot believe I forgot to mention is that the title of the track is a pun. There are a lot of puns on this album, many of which, as an American and also a person born over 20 years after this album came out, I am not really equipped to talk about. This one, however, is a little bit more simple, and it is a pun on the Firth of Forth, which is a large estuary in Scotland. I imagine most of you watching this video knew that already. However, it is one of those things that critics are legally mandated to bring up every time we review the album, so I'm glad we got it out of the way. More Fool Me is the second and final example during the Peter Gabriel-led era of Genesis, of Phil Collins taking lead vocal. And I would say it's probably stronger than For Absent Friends, but at the same time, it's very interesting. You almost get the sense that Phil sang this because nobody else wanted to. It's a very interesting little song in how it fits together, in that it winds up, when I listen to it, sounding both very composed and almost a little bit like a song fragment. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a completed track. It works, but it fits together in kind of a weird way that I like it, but it is the weakest thing on the album. I do have a lot of affection for it, though. It's not one that I skip, and some people, I guess, really hate this because of the general sort of bitterness at Phil Collins for, the perceived blame for where the band eventually moved in his tenure as lead singer, which, well, we'll get to that point in Genesis history eventually. But, for now, it's a fun little song. So side 2 begins with the Battle of Epping Forest, the longest track on the album, and very much its centerpiece. They apparently spent a lot of time in the sessions trying to really nail down this track, and as a result, several of the members have over the years expressed the opinion that it is a little bit overwrought. I kind of agree and disagree with that. This definitely has the most moving parts of any of the Gabriel era epics, and possibly any of the Genesis epics in general. It's a sort of thematic partner to Get 'Em Out by Friday on the previous album, in that it is a track satirizing the contemporary London underworld. In this case, the lyrical subject matter being a massive battle in Epping Forest between two factions of thugs in a dispute over East End protection rackets. Everything I said about the lyrics on this album applies here. They're very layered, they're very intricate. I'm very much not sure I understand all of it. Of all of the Genesis tracks I've reviewed thus far in this series, this is definitely the one I had to look up the meaning of the most, because I would have been totally lost. There are, however, some things I can understand without assistance, like the beautiful satirical irony of the way the song uses language that in the Victorian era and earlier in the medieval period was used for knights and crusaders who were considered to be these virtuous men to describe, these gangsters and petty thieves attacking each other in the forest. Something I do appreciate is that for all of the moving parts, for all of the complexity and the virtuosic playing, it is actually surprisingly conventionally structured. There are a whole bunch of verses set up in a way that is not particularly conventional, but there is something resembling a chorus that repeats twice, and beyond that, there is something resembling a middle eight. This very amusing but also biting narrative of this sort of crooked, new agey religious figure who is implied to be somehow in bed with the gangsters. There's also a lyric I've never entirely known what to make of about a character who I think is meant to be a reporter for an art magazine dashing up a tree amidst the fray. It's also very cynical in the way that Get 'Em Out by Friday is cynical. The resolution of this massed gangland battle is that all of the participants are dead in the morning, and the bosses on whose behest they were fighting flip a coin to settle the matter. A pleasant 4-minute instrumental after the ordeal is the third of the 4 shorter tracks on this album. Actually, from what I understand, was not originally supposed to be a part of the record. If I remember what I read in my research correctly, it was actually only included because of a later dispute over the length of one of the other long songs between several other members, and I don't remember which one it was. I am glad this is on the album. It makes for some cool atmospheric decompression after the pomp and grandeur of the Battle of Epping Forest. Although it does contribute to this album being a little bit longer than was ideal on vinyl records, which was kind of a Genesis thing in general. I think Foxtrot and this album are all a little bit overlong by vinyl standards. The ideal for a vinyl record really was 35 to 45 minutes. Anything beyond that, you were kind of sacrificing a little bit of sonic clarity for that time. And Genesis albums were not produced amazingly to begin with. Like I said, I'm glad it's on here. It reminds me a little bit, at least the second part of it, of A Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum, although that being said, I'm pretty sure A Whiter Shade of Pale is itself based primarily on some Bach composition, so maybe it's just drawing from the same source. I don't know. Either way, it's a very strong track, and I enjoy it. So we come to The Cinema Show, the final epic of the album. It is a 2-part composition divided into roughly 5-minute intervals, the first of which is a pastoral, folksy prog track, very loosely based on the Fire Sermon segment of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, from which some of the imagery of the 2 main characters, and also the allusion to Tiresias, a notable character of Greek mythology, with many different traits and appearances, going all the way back to his spectral appearance in one of the earliest works of Western literature, Homer's Odyssey. The band recast this into a Ray Davies-esque character study, which then transforms into a much more intricate and involved progressive rock track, with a long instrumental break between 2 things that kind of resemble choruses, but kind of aren't choruses. Who knows? I think of them as choruses. That's what we're calling them in my review. And when that's over, you get the next part of the song, a roughly 5-minute synth solo from Banks, along with the opening of Firth of Fifth. It's probably one of my favorite Banks solos. And it also reminds me of something I forgot to mention earlier, which is that this album marks roughly the turning point where Tony Banks essentially just becomes the dominant instrument in Genesis. I mean, that was always kind of the case, but this is where the balance really starts to shift. And so that transitions into Isle of Plenty, a slight reprise of some themes from Dancing with the Moonlit Night, which closes out the album with some weird imagery about supermarkets and English decline that I am not entirely sure I fully understand, and a bunch of overlapping vocals saying things about supermarkets and also the title of the album. It's a good way to end the record. Selling England by the Pound is one of the quintessential prog albums. If I was going to introduce someone to the genre, if I was going to introduce someone to Genesis, this would be one of the very first albums I sent them to. Maybe not the first. There's a lot of very long, very intricate songs that one could have a little bit of trouble assimilating at first. But on the whole, it is one of the most rewarding and satisfying albums the band ever released, and one of the true masterpieces of the year 1973. In many respects, arguably the high point for progressive rock as a genre. And we have pretty much reached the end of the Peter Gabriel era here. There is one more album. It is a massive, sprawling event album, but in many respects, it is a total departure for the band. You know, it's hard to stress how different The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is from this, because it really is. You have an almost complete shift in both songwriting and the actual style of the band that in many ways prefigures the later development of both the pop era of the group and Peter Gabriel's solo career, more so than anything else they did while they were together. And so that adds a different gravitas to Selling England by the Pound. It becomes not just the culmination of the Gabriel era Genesis style, but in a way the farewell to. And what a magnificent send-off it is. I know I said last time that Foxtrot is the best Genesis album, but this one, in a lot of ways, deserves that title as much, if not more so, because there are no really clear B-side type tracks here, whereas to an extent there are on Foxtrot. And if I can center things once more upon my own personal experience with this band, this is the album of theirs. I mean, really, this is true of all the Peter Gabriel albums, but this is the one that when I was like a young teenage prog fan, this is the one I really burned myself out on. And I've often found in the last several years that I don't come back to this one a lot for that reason, because it is the one that is just seared into my head. And yet when I was listening to this today, I was really astonished by not just how much I remembered it, but how good this album is, and how much I wanted not just to listen to it more, but to tell everybody else about it. You know, often with this bunch of videos, like for the most part, these reviews are old ground. These are albums that I think most people watching my channel will know probably everything about. In a lot of respects, in a lot of cases, I would imagine many of the people watching these videos will in fact know these albums better than I do. And so it's rare when I'm putting these together that I really feel that, you know, I need to tell the world about these albums. But when I was listening to this today, I felt in that moment that I needed to tell the world about this. And so this has certainly been a way to close out the video. I feel like every time I do these, I give these weird mealy-mouthed endings where I'm like, I promise next week we'll do whatever. But actually, what I'm going to tell you is that I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is a phenomenal album, but it is a very, very big and dense album, and I want to really be prepared to talk about it. So it will probably be longer than normal between this review and that one. I'm going to finish the Nirvana videos. I'm going to do a bunch of other videos I've been excited to work on. I have a little semi-mini series that may or may not even come to fruition depending on how much time I have, of bands that sound like Genesis, and I want to talk about some genres that I have not delved particularly deep into. So we'll see how much of it actually happens, but you know, I'm just putting it out there. Anyway, I will see you all later. You all have a very fine evening or morning or afternoon or whatever time of day you happen to be watching these videos in. Bye.